So, we're supposed to introduce ourselves. I'm Glenn Loury and teach economics at Brown University, and you are?
John McWhorter, Senior Fellow at the Manhattan Institute, and I write a weekly column for the New York Sun.
And the reason we're talking to each other is because, well, it's just fun for us to talk to each other, huh?
We like to spar, I think.
We spar about all matters political and intellectual.
Cultural, that's right.
Bearing on culture and politics and social analysis, issues of race and other issues as well.
That's right. Glenn, I'm going to break the fourth wall for a second and ask the assistant to make it so that I can't see myself. It's just too weird for me. Okay, here we go. We're back.
Okay.
So we're ready.
So, we have to start arguing. They say that these conversations are more interesting when people disagree. And
we have to have the conflict. So, what are we going to fight about this time?
We have a lot of things to argue about, I would think. So, Clarence Thomas strikes again. He's in the minority with Scalia in this recently handed down decision that you were telling me about when we were talking earlier on sentencing guidelines and, these draconian 25-year or whatever sentences people are getting. And how is it that he always manages to vote against what, to my mind, at least seems like very sensible and even progressive criminal justice policy?
He has a position that is based on his interpretation of the Constitution and what the judicial branch is about. And he happens to have a very jaundiced eye towards what you and I call progressive legislation, which is often a matter of squaring the corners, and I personally am inclined to doing it a lot more than he is.
I don't understand. Squaring the corner. What do you mean by that? I'm sorry.
Well, in the fact that what we want to do is make things fairer for people who are left behind, which means jiggering the system in some ways sometimes. We want to give people chances that under the ordinary workings of the free market they wouldn't necessarily have. Thomas has no particular time for that sort of thing. And I think that just because he's black, just because of the history of his people, just because of the history of himself, in the pure intellectual sense, I respect that that's his position. It's peculiar, but I can't hate him for it the way many people do.
Oh, well, no, who's got time to hate anybody? But, what you're saying is, and I believe this is borne out by Thomas's jurisprudential record, is that various institutional reforms, like the New Deal, he has an intellectual position against them in that, he's entitled to that position. Just because he's black doesn't mean he has to think a certain way. And while, of course, I agree that he's entitled to his position as a human being and that his race ought not to have any bearing on that, I also agree that, only a Neanderthal would oppose the New Deal. I agree. Maybe I should put it this way. When Thurgood Marshall was on the court, he gave this speech in 1987, if I'm not mistaken, the bicentennial of the Constitution year, in which he said the Constitution was flawed from the very start. It accommodated slavery. It needed to be amended and reformed. It continues to need to be understood and interpreted in light of some deeper moral and ethical claims. It seems to me that that's a very sensible position.
I get it, Glenn, but the thing is, that is not the final word on the matter. And this is just a matter of pulling the camera back, so to speak, and trying to get yourself into a person's head while trying to see if you can do it in a way where your sense of morality is not aroused. And I am capable of doing that with Thomas, and it's not a matter of somebody like him being a Neanderthal either. So, in fact, the New Deal, when I think of the New Deal, I get all rosy inside. I'm in favor of it. It did correct the flaws that were inherent in the system, but there are thoroughly intelligent people, and I know some of them, who think that even the New Deal was carried out wrong and that there shouldn't have been this. And this is what's important. That's not a Neanderthal view, because many of those people will argue with A to B to C reasoning that if there had been no deal, things still could have gone in a positive way for those left behind. So, for example, there are black people who think that A, Philip Randolph was doing just fine with the sort of efforts that he was pushing forth, and that slowly, black people would have been where they are right now, or even better.
But we know those people are wrong, don't we?
Doesn't history
tell us that they're wrong?
In what way?
Pardon?
In what way? How can we scientifically know that they were wrong? I mean, we can't replay it.
I don't know. Scientifically, beyond a doubt, I don't know. It's not that kind of knowledge, is it? It's more of a kind of practical wisdom that's accumulated through observing societies over time. But what I'm saying is, I think what we know is that the social safety net and the regulation of markets and the limits on free enterprise and the redistributive aspects of New Deal policy and the strengthening of labor unions and all of these things are part, along with economic growth and the expansion of the market and capitalism and the accumulation of wealth. These other mitigating egalitarian institutions are part of what it takes to make for a successful political economy in the 21st century. Everywhere you look, this is what's happened.
Yeah, but then on the other hand, playing devil's advocate, some would say that you have to remember that there was about to be a post-war economy. Now, of course, nobody knew that in 1933, but once there's some people who say that you can make models that show that the rising tide would have lifted all boats, all of which is to say, that is not something I would say, it's not the argument I prefer, but it means that a person like Clarence Thomas is not necessarily a Neanderthal. Now, somebody might make his kind of arguments, and all they're saying is, bootstraps, my grandfather, etc., etc. But he doesn't give me an indication of being that troglodytic in his thoughts.
Well,
do you take my point?
John, I'm not going to debate with you whether he's a troglodyte or a Neanderthal. Okay?
Well, you said Neanderthal.
All I'm saying is that he's wrong about social policy, and I think you agree with me about that. And I think what we're arguing about is whether or not he has a right to be wrong. I mean, I don't know.
No, we're arguing whether he has a right to be an iconoclast, and especially with the looming issue of the fact that he grew up poor and black himself, etc. And I'm just saying that his views are not ones that sit very well with the way I think, but his views are not of the kind which I can reject as just, Neanderthal or immoral or not worth considering or underinformed. There are views such as that. Thomas's are not those, it has always seemed to me.
Let's agree to disagree about this because I don't follow what you're saying here. I mean, here's what I think you're saying. I think you're saying there are people out there who just hate this guy kind of mindlessly and with a visceral intensity that you just reject. Okay,
yeah, I think because it doesn't make coherent sense to me.
Pardon?
Because it doesn't make coherent sense to me. If you actually follow what his reasoning is in case after case, you find that it's not that he's the devil, it's just that he has a different sense of priorities than we have, and that he has a certain kind of faith in the future working out under a free market system, which is not one that a lot of people would agree with. Take today, for example, in his being in the minority and being against reducing the sentencing disparity between crack and powdered cocaine.
Yeah.
Obviously, that's not what I would call a civil rights concerned jurist, but on the other hand, the fact is that he's really just making a particular narrow point about which branch of the government has jurisdiction
I'm sorry, John. I just can't be. I have to object, as a matter of fact, because the stakes here are enormous. Okay, so this guy, Clarence Thomas, we're talking about, Supreme Court Justice Thomas. He's 1/9 of the Supreme Court, which is 1/3 of the American state. The stakes here are absolutely stupefyingly large, so that while every person is entitled to their view, when a person stands, as it were, athwart historical progress and is an agent of, what people might consider to be reactionary or retrograde views, they deserve to be vigorously criticized. Because there are people who hate them unreasoningly doesn't mean that the judgment that they're destructive in the effects of their exercise of their responsibilities of office, that they're destructive, that the things that they do are actually harmful to people, that in their error they're actually kind of holding back progress. These are serious professional indictments against people for the content of their views, and it seems to me this is the standard that we have to judge Thomas by.
Well, I would withhold that that judgment until we consider whether or not he has observed that there's clearly a movement in the legislative branch towards the direction that I think most of us would want to go anyway. And then you have to remember that there are quite a few black people, and I don't just mean, blinkered black conservatives, but quite a few black people in black communities who really feel that the disparity is perfectly good, that it keeps violent people out of their communities. I'm not one of them, but there are reasonable people who will say that. And you could say that Clarence's view also represents them. Just because the New York Times is not as likely to air the views of people like that doesn't mean that they don't count.
Well, I note that the decision was 7-2 in the cases in which he was in the minority whose opinion was announced today. So, it's not just sort of left-wing people who would necessarily think this. It's not just the New York Times. I think he's outside the mainstream by a substantial margin. But be that as it may, I mean, the other thing about Thomas and his race is that I've always found so deeply ironic is that it seems so obvious to me in historical perspective that but for his race he wouldn't be on the court. That is, that he's occupying, if you like, the black seat on the United States Supreme Court, that there is such a thing and that he's holding it. And that nevertheless, it seems like the logic of his own philosophy has to deny that in some very deep way, that he has to say, well, it really hasn't got anything to do with race, when in fact it had a great deal, not everything, but I think a great deal to do with race, that he was elevated to the court to replace Thurgood Marshall.
Of course.
So I wonder whether you think, John, any responsibilities go along with the opportunities that are presented to people like ourselves in virtue of the fact that we are black. That is that, individuals are responding to us in part and presenting us with chances to do things in part because of the fact that we're black. Does that entail any obligation on our part?
I don't know, Glenn. I hear what you mean, and I'm very happy about the Supreme Court decision today. I mean, frankly, I personally am glad that Thomas is in the minority. So let's not, I don't want there to be an impression that I'm saying that I wish that Thomas's view had won out. It's just a matter of how we feel about Thomas, and then we get back to what you just said about
on the sentencing disparity issue.
Something, as far as I'm concerned, on the one hand, to feel about affirmative action or racial preferences in particular, that they have gone too far, they've outlived their usefulness after they've applied to you, is in itself a perfectly coherent position. It's one that I take, and I'm not afraid to say it. Yet it's not that you seek affirmative action, but if you are black and you're in certain climes, you really can't avoid it. And it was after watching myself and other people that I began to realize, hey, maybe it's time to let this go. I think that is perfectly fine. But, on the other hand, in Justice Thomas's book, I would say that one of the weakest parts for me is a rather tortured sense of what role race played in his becoming a Supreme Court justice. Now, he's very open about it with Yale, but then with the Supreme Court, I would have to say that from what I know of his book, which is having read it a couple of times, there is a rationalization. That is a weak link. But in terms of the responsibility...
Hold on. Can we just not go too fast past that? You read the book a couple of times, and what you're saying is that he's rationalizing, and it's a weak link in his position.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, just want to make sure the listening audience didn't miss that.
Oh yeah, that's important. I'm not trying to mute that at all. That is a definite problem with his reasoning. But in terms of the responsibility, I just want to briefly say all of us have our priorities, and few of us are perfect. And okay, Thomas may have let go of that sense of responsibility, although I think it's because he thinks that if things are the way he has it, it'll be better for us in the end, whether or not that's true. But in his personal life, he does a lot of very responsible things. So once again, I can't judge.
Okay, John. So let me give you my 2 cents on the affirmative action thing. So I think we substantially agree, but the thing is, you say people like you or myself might both benefit from affirmative action and nevertheless come into, from our experience and observation, knowledge that there are flaws with affirmative action, maybe even fatal flaws, and there's no inconsistency with having benefited within one's life. I mean, after all, what can you do? And at the same time having reached an intellectual position that it's a bad policy. I think that's correct. I mean, I think that's a very fair statement, and indeed, as I know you know, I argued against affirmative action for many years, and kind of pretty much precisely from that perspective.
You were one of my models for doing so. Yes.
That's very comforting to know. But I would then go on to say, don't our experiences in a way that is the successful cases of affirmative action, if I can put it like that, people getting opportunities maybe to do things in part because they're interesting. What they have to say is interesting because they're black and because their identity matters, right? I mean, even a critic, here's the irony of it, even someone who's criticizing affirmative action, even someone who's making a career criticizing affirmative action, if they're black, may get a boost because of their race, in that the effect of their own criticism has a sort of deeper resonance. You know, it has a kind of more truth-telling witness. You understand what I'm saying?
Oh, sure. And I mean, that's true.
So a reflective person, it seems to me, is required in the face of this kind of, I don't know, profound irony to at least not be so, one-dimensional and so kind of, almost sloganeering about their, what am I trying to say here? It's that...
You mean that Thomas is sloganeering?
Yeah, right. I mean, Thomas's simplistic anti-affirmative action view, his pronouncements about the kind of profound harm that taking race into account necessarily and always does. And his what I think is a kind of lack of subtlety in his thought about the fact that race is such an endemic part of American society, even to the point where the constitution of our judicial bodies is informally and indirectly but powerfully influenced by racial identity, and so on like that. And that the overcoming, you say, the Second World War, the big boom of the economy, all these good progressive things that were going on in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s in the United States might well have brought about racial equality anyway. But I think the data, and anecdotal and systematic, are pretty overwhelming to the effect that the progress of the African American middle class in the post-1960s era, the penetration of blacks into major institutions of the society, and the reflection of the experience and outlook of African Americans from our life experience in the deliberations of major and exclusive institutions has been beneficially affected by affirmative action policy. So I don't understand why our black justice, the guy who's holding the black seat on the Supreme Court, can't see that.
Because, now we hit up against that wall that you always hit up against in the media, which is this is not the written medium, and we could go so many places. But concisely, what you're saying, Glenn, sounds to me, and I know that you are a wide-ranging thinker, but in the general thinking public, what you just said is largely The Shape of the River. It's the book by Bowen and Bach from, 11, 12 years ago now.
I admire that book. I don't think it's been quite that long, but I admire that book, right.
Yeah, the benefits of racial preferences.
1998, I think, is the original publication date of that book.
That's
so
right.
9 years.
I remember that year. I remember reading about it. Yeah. And the thing is that there has been, unfortunately in places that the general public is unlikely to read, a lot of very intelligent argumentation against the reasoning and the statistics in that book, mostly having appeared in law reviews such as UCLA, which I'm influenced by. I don't find that book as compelling as many do, that is the way that it had to be, these affirmative action policies. And more to the point, I'm gonna admit something here that I don't think I've ever written about directly, but it does matter, which is that it's not necessarily, at least in my case, that I'm this successful affirmative action person and that I get out and come out on top of the world and then say, actually, this wasn't a good idea because of what people might be thinking about me. The fact is, one line on my CV is that I taught at Cornell and Ivy School for 1 year. And I was there because they had a special fund for candidates who were a pretty color. And so they could hire a white person, and then they could also toss me into the bargain. None of the people involved were evil, but I was hopelessly underqualified to be teaching at that school, not only in terms of the subject matter, but in terms of what my abilities were at that very early stage. And I went to that school, and for every person who found me kind of charming, because I know how to hold a classroom, the fact of the matter is I made a bit of a fool of myself, because I really didn't belong there. And that's a story I'm telling about myself, because I would never tell stories about other people who I've seen. But that's what happens to a person. I'm not hurting over that. But the fact of the matter is that affirmative action, when misapplied, or racial preferences, can create things like that. And what happened to me was not just a little exception. It wasn't just a hair out of place. That's what it is in higher education.
Okay, but what I would say to that is, I hear you, and I know that story, and I can relate to it. And I've seen that happen to people, and it's not a good thing. I would say a couple of things. I mean, one is, that's not a reason. That excess and that cost, that problem, is not a reason to blanketly reject affirmative action. It's a reason to not do the particular thing that we're talking about, appointing people who are not yet able or qualified to positions for which they're not yet able or qualified. That doesn't exhaust all that's in. And I think the point I'm making now, that affirmative action is more than these kinds of mistakes that you're characterizing, is reflected in the literature about the shape of the river. Because I know this work that you're referring to, for example, in the UCLA Law Review piece, I forget the guy's name, I may think of it in a moment, who points out that in legal education anyway, there's a strong case that might be made that preferential admissions to law schools have actually retarded the development of blacks in the legal profession.
You're talking about Richard Sander recently.
Richard Sander.
Yeah.
But the interesting thing about the shape of the river, it was mainly about elite college education, mainly about 4-year college degrees at elite universities. And I think the record there is really much better. I mean, both in terms of people are graduating, and, I could go on and repeat what the shape of the river says. They follow the people. They see the success that they have in their careers, the wages, the influence that they have on their communities through civic involvement and so forth. And they make the case that if you're running a Princeton or a Brown or a Cornell, and you could admit 10 kids for every seat that you have who are more or less qualified to do the work, that one of the things that you might want to do, amongst many other things that you're doing, including preferring athletes and alumni and many other things that you're doing, one of the things that you might want to do is to contribute to the development of elite cadres of well-trained and well-connected people who come from these disadvantaged and excluded, previously historically excluded groups, so that they can move into the society and have their beneficial influence. That's one of the things a college can do. And they have so many talented people to admit, and they, in some sense, have so many criteria in their selection. Why wouldn't a Princeton or a Brown or a Cornell want to take it on as their civic and philanthropic duty to try to contribute to the society in this way? This seems to me to be a completely defensible thing. I don't think there's any data that prove that this objective has been shown to be wrong.
Well, no, and I mean, when you're talking about the kind of affirmative action that goes on at, say, Princeton or Harvard, the Ivies and maybe 3 other schools, I don't see any problem with it even today, because test scores are not a perfect measure and there's a certain high standard. That's fine. And also,
it's going to be more than 3 other schools, if I could just say. I mean, it's going to be like the top 10% of the schools.
We could say that. Or more to the point, any kind of affirmative action that was going on from roughly 1966 until roughly 1980, 81, 82, I get it. We were talking about a generation, and there's no problem with it there. My point has always been, when do you stop this? And it's not when society is perfect, and you certainly don't have starkly 2-tier classes like was it the case at UCLA and UC Berkeley for the time being, until the composition of the schools looks exactly like the ethnic composition of California, because then you end up having too much of the kind of placement of people over their heads and all of the social
I agree with that. I mean, I think
that creates.
I've always said about affirmative action that it really matters, how much you do. And people always talk about it as like it's an all or nothing, but let's say if you're at Berkeley or somewhere and you could have a kind of target of you want like 3 or 4% of the class to be from the disadvantaged groups, or you want 6 or 8%, or you want 10 or 12%, or you want 18 or 20%, and those things are very, very different things, with very different consequences. And little bit of affirmative, quote unquote, a little bit of affirmative action may be not as problematic, and a lot of it may have all these horror stories that. But let me ask you something else. John, and do you think that Clarence Thomas's competency is up to the job? I mean, do you think a lot of people have suggested this? He doesn't speak on the bench. His opinions have not exactly created a, sort of firestorm of, I should say, have not exactly a groundswell of following in the legal academy of people who are saying, this is a great legal thinker. Is he over his head?
Well, I would say this, that what you just said could also be said of some of the other justices. So is he the most remarkable human brain on the court? I would say that that's certainly not true of him. No one would say that of Justice Ginsburg either, for example, and I have no problem with her that I've seen. But so on that, there. But he's not, apparently, based on what's been written about him by people more favorable to him over the years, the hack that it appeared that he was in the beginning. I do wish, however, and who am I to wish something about that man's behavior, I wish that he would speak, because that excuse that he's given about having grown up speaking Gullah, I don't think really holds. I mean, if he did grow up speaking Gullah, he doesn't speak it anymore. He
stopped speaking Gullah a long time ago.
Yeah, he needs to just talk, because people who don't talk and can't kind of go on the fly, there's always a question as to whether or not you're as sharp as everybody else. With him, I don't think we know, because he doesn't apparently seem inclined to try.
I mean, I too don't want to take cheap shots. And, he said he doesn't want to talk. He says he thinks the other justices talk too much. They need to shut up. But what strikes me is that, what I know of legal scholarship and education and kind of the culture of the law and a legal academy is that it's a culture of argument.
I know.
It's a culture of debate. They're always throwing back the hypotheticals, and they're always parsing the technicalities and the details. This is what they do.
Yes.
So
and
to not do it is very striking. It stands out.
Just sitting there listening. Yeah. It's not pretty. It's not pretty at all.
Yeah.
But to the extent that he might just be shy, and Glenn, if the man was a little shy about having his spontaneous statements on any kind of record, even anecdotally, it would be understandable. But if he is kind of shy, then that's too bad. I kind of wish he would get over it, too, to show what he's made of. So we can see that he is made of it.
I think that you said just right. Show what he's made of. In other words, it's another one of these subtle things about the world that we live in, where this racial transformation has taken place and where people like ourselves come into positions and institutions where blacks haven't much been before. And, whether there's formal affirmative action or not, whatever, the eyes are watching and there's something to be proven. Unfortunately.
Yeah.
Right? Unfortunately, the question is he really good enough? I look out at my graduate students year in and year out, and I've been doing this for 30 years, okay? And I've got a track record. I've published a lot of stuff, right?
Yes.
But I still sometimes feel that these kids are sitting there looking at me, waiting to see if I'm really as good as I need to be because I'm black. And they come in kind of half wondering, well, did I get there by some special dispensation,
Oh, well, that'll go on for all of our lives. I had that same thing. I had one class where I pulled a few tricks to make sure that they knew that I knew my linguistics and that I knew more than them. Because I thought, let's just get that out of the way. Yeah, that's
this is the thing.
Black in America.
You have to actually confront that. You can't just, pretend that it doesn't exist and say, I don't complain about it. I'm not going to prove anything to you. Because you just reinforce their doubts and it's not fair. It's not the way things should be, maybe, but it's just
the way things are. Oh, yeah, definitely. We're stuck with that. And I wish that he thought that way, certainly.
Yeah. Well, okay. So what else should we argue about?
What were the other topics? We have a list this morning. My appalling statements about Professor Massey's work. Do you think they're appalling?
Well,
we were going to do Palestine. Those were the two I remember.
Yeah, no, we should do them both. Let's talk about Massey first, if you don't mind.
Okay.
No, I only want to say, okay, so you wrote a book called Winning the Race. Okay?
I did.
So in your book, you take umbrage and you take exception with the kind of conventional wisdom of a lot of sociological thinking about race and inequality in the United States. And you kind of name names and go down the list of people's work which you find wanting. One of whom is Douglas Massey, whose classic book, I don't remember the year, with Nancy Denton called American Apartheid.
I want to say 1980.
Yeah, I don't know.
That might be a little early.
Yeah, I think 80 is early, but anyway, it's a good 15 years ago at least. Sort of threw down the gauntlet of kind of saying, racial segregation and discrimination in American society, residential segregation, ghettos, central city neighborhoods that are preponderantly black. It's a legacy of oppression and racism in American society. It's a massive problem, and it has huge consequences and so forth and so on. And you take issue with that book. And we can talk about that book, which I admire, and we can discuss your criticisms of it and whatnot. But my larger point is I look at Doug Massey at Princeton, and I look at the corpus of his work. And this is one of the leading. He's been president of the American Sociological Association.
Yeah, I noticed that. Yeah.
He's written extensively about immigration. The guy is Spanish is absolutely fluent. He's done a lot of study of Mexican immigration to the United States. He's got this whole big project that has produced a couple of books now on surveying college freshmen and then following them through their college years to find out about not only their academic but also their social and identity and other kind of dynamics. He wrote a book a couple of years ago called The Return of the L Word.
I read that.
Which is a spirited defense of liberalism. We could discuss that, but I think it just shows his range. And now he's got a new book out called Categorically Unequal, which I've begun to read. It's not something you're going to read in a day or two. It's a very sort of sturdy, rich, well-informed social theory of inequality. And I'm looking at this guy, and he's 50? And I'm saying this guy is one of the great social thinkers of our time.
And he's one of poking at him
how
with
can
a
you,
stick,
you know,
right?
how can you just dismiss this guy with the back of your hand? Is what I'm saying.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I see what you mean. And Glenn, it's very simple. It is very simple. In that book, I'm taking American apartheid, not the guy's whole career, and nowhere in the book do I even imply that I consider him to be, a hack or anything like that. I just read that particular book, and I found the reasoning flawed, and in a nutshell, my main issue was that he claims that, when there's a certain percentage of black people in the neighborhood, and we've shown this via statistical modeling, then all of these ills have to happen, such as high rates of welfare recipiency, et cetera, et cetera. When, then, in the same book, he talks about how there's this North Lawndale neighborhood in Chicago.
I'm sorry, would you just repeat the last? With the same breath, I just didn't understand it.
Okay, and then, in the same book, he discusses how in North Lawndale in Chicago, the neighborhood is 75% Latino, and yet that one is a stable working-class neighborhood. And my only problem with it is, I'm not accusing him of anything unsavory. It seemed to me that the reasoning that he uses to imply that segregation, i.e. black people being all in one neighborhood, is the reason, it doesn't hold up to me. And this is what's important. I didn't only read American Apartheid. I figured this reasoning must be fleshed out in the actual academic articles that this book is based on. And so I went and I read them, sincerely looking to find where I was going wrong. And I genuinely couldn't. And so in that book I put forth, here is my issue with Professor Massey on this particular point.
So let's argue about that a minute, because I know this argument that, segregation in and of itself can't necessarily be so bad if other groups which are segregated also don't exhibit the same degree of pathology. Did I correctly state that?
I think so. I want to see where you're about to go.
Okay. Don't agree before you know what you're agreeing to. Fair enough.
Okay. But what's the counterexample? I
offer that as a brief summary. I may not capture the entire nuance of your argument, but in any case, what I want to say about it is, I see that, and of course, it's not just segregation. Okay? Because you could imagine enclaves, I don't know what, Orthodox Jews somewhere in Brooklyn, I don't know what, Chinese in a Chinatown somewhere.
More importantly, that.
Whatever. You could imagine enclaves that are relatively homogeneous, but that are also highly functional. Right? Mm-hmm. So correct. I mean, if the point is there's no logical necessity in the fact of separation leading to dysfunction, of course that's correct. On the other hand, we have the particular history of African Americans in the United States. It could well be true that while there's no necessary logical requirement that segregation leads to dysfunction, that in the case of African Americans in the United States, it could be true that segregation is associated with dysfunction. And that becomes an empirical question, right?
And I don't think that he supplied a suitable answer.
I'm sorry,
What's your suitable
answer?
I just didn't understand. And I don't think that he supplied a suitable case that does happen to be the case with black Americans. Can you? What's your reason that you think that he was right?
Well, I would look to the kinds of studies like these guys, Glazer and Cutler at Harvard. These are the economists who look across American cities at the degree of residential segregation by race, and who ask in an article in the Quarterly Journal of Economics from the mid or late 1990s, they have a paper called "Are Ghettos Good or Bad?" Okay. And what it's meant to be is a careful, sort of econometrically precise examination of this question. And I say that because they're worried about the distinction between a correlation or an association in the data between one thing and the other, and real causal connections between those things. So it could well be true that if you look across American cities, the big American cities with big ghettos also have more dysfunction amongst the black population. But it doesn't follow from that the fact of segregation caused the dysfunction. This is just what we were talking about before. So I just cite this one article. There are other studies, but this gives some sense of, I think, what is the consensus view amongst urban social analysts that in the case of African Americans in the big American cities in the years of the 20th century after the First and Second World Wars, where we had these large migrations and such, that in fact you do see a causal connection between segregation and black disadvantage, and they try to quantify it and such. I can't remember off the top of my head the exact numbers they come up with,
right.
But it's data like that as well as other data that one could look at. But it's data like that lead me to think, segregation has associated with it inequality in the structure of opportunity for human development.
And this is the one thing, though. And I am waiting for somebody to go into the archives and to do some work to disprove me on this with a systematic argument. But the fact is, I don't even have to look at these sources, and I will. But I know, without looking, that what they don't take into account with all of those fancy equations, etc., is the changes in the welfare laws in the late 60s. People like you often tell me that I exaggerate their import. But I want to hear Wait. I want to hear a systematic reason why it would not be the case that new laws that allow people not to work for a living and pay people to have children, although they were well-intentioned, those laws didn't exist in 1960, they existed by 1970. Why that would not break up already fragile communities and create things that we don't want. And you say I exaggerate, but there's no actual smoking gun argument that I'm exaggerating on that. And until Massey takes that into account instead of not writing about it, I just can't see the argument as complete.
No, the book's about segregation. It's not about welfare. So, no, I agree it's not in Massey, and I think you're correct that Cutler and Glaser don't make much use of changes in welfare administrative practice. But I want to say a couple of things. First of all, I'm not persuaded by the evidence that the change in welfare rules caused the things that you say. To me, that's a post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy. It's all based on timing. Secondly,
timing.
Let me just finish this and then you can rebut it. Secondly, what happened in the 1960s largely was a removal of barriers to people's exercising of rights that they actually had. The whole, I'm thinking about Ira Katznelson's book, When Affirmative Action Was White, which is do you know the book that I'm talking about?
I read it.
Yeah, A History of the New Deal, where he's saying, one of the things that went on with the shaping of various social insurance programs, including aid to families with dependent children, welfare, was that they were set up in such a way to leave a lot of discretion in the hands of local administration, so that especially in the South, people could administer those programs in ways that were commensurate with their own racial attitudes and so on. Yeah. So the roles that the rise of blacks and low-income blacks on the welfare rolls that you see in the 1960s, I think, is largely a consequence of the eradication of various barriers to people's participation in a program to which they were entitled to participate. Now, we can judge at the end of the day whether or not welfare needed to be reformed. I was one of the people who said all along while it was being reformed, just like for the exact reasons that you were stating, bad incentives, bad effect on the moral life of communities and so forth, that it needed to be reformed. But to blame it, to say it's the causal agent in the production of a structural situation as grave and as pronounced as black disadvantage and dysfunction strikes me as a stretch. I don't, I'm waiting to be persuaded, but I haven't seen the evidence that leads me to that conclusion. In fact, I think the evidence goes in the other direction. So, for example, welfare payments were falling steadily, being eroded by inflation and being held constant at nominal terms for a good 20 years before welfare was reformed, and yet you saw the rolls continue to rise and you saw these dysfunction problems expand, even though welfare payments were going in the other direction. So, I don't know, but I guess we'll be arguing about this for a long time.
The amount of the payments doesn't matter. It's just what a community's relationship towards working ended up being because of the changes in the policies. And it's not, and I think you know this, it's not just that black women were allowed to take advantage of the policies that white women were allowed to take advantage of. There was a targeted effort to change the policies, and your I see how you're phrasing it as changes in welfare administration. But more to the point, it was a matter of how the laws worked in terms of how easy it was to get on it and how much anybody was interested in you getting off of it and getting a job. And that completely changed. So that the idea of I'm going to go to the welfare office, get on it, no questions asked, live on it for the rest of my life. Nobody decided to do that. But if that's how things ended up happening, nobody at the welfare office.
I'm sorry. That did change. But the question is whether or not it caused the things that we see. And I want to let me just try something else. So we know the work that Thomas. We both know. I know you've spoken about it in some of your writing somewhere. The work of Thomas Segru, the historian about Detroit.
Yes.
So here's a careful study of a particular city where he goes from the 1940s to the 1960s, and he traces through in terms of the politics, in terms of the residential segregation and housing, in terms of the labor market and employment and the rest. What the kind of social history of that city was and how you went from a hopeful migration of blacks into the city with the World War II expansion that drew a lot of labor in the 40s of people who were upwardly mobile and hoping to sort of build new lives for themselves and move into the middle class, to the kind of stagnation and the social pathology of the ghetto, quote unquote, that you see in Detroit by the late 1960s. And the role of structural forces, quite apart from welfare. I'm talking about jobs and discrimination. I'm talking about neighborhood residential segregation. I'm talking about the way the schools are set up and administered. I'm talking about the funds that are available to the municipality. I'm talking about the way that the federal government finances housing and whether or not it engages in redlining and discrimination along with the banks and the insurance companies. I'm talking about people running for mayor telling the white ethnics of the city that they're going to keep the niggers out of their neighborhood so that their children will be safe. These are all huge factors. Now, there's welfare as well. How is it that we look at that history and we come out with welfare as the kind of single thread on which we're going to hang this whole large historical dynamic? It strikes me
that is the perfect book. Because Segru shows that by 1967, when the riots happened, you had a lot of things that are familiar today. People were fed up, and you can't say that welfare was the cause of that because the welfare changes were happening exactly then.
Right.
And the fact of the matter is that if you read Segru, and I have, and I think it's a really great book. I have no problem with what he shows.
Right.
It's that if we could go back in a time machine now to Detroit, inner city Detroit, 1967, I think a lot of people would be very happy to live in that rather than what was going to happen soon after that. And so, okay, factory jobs are starting to move away. You have to hustle more to find a job. You've got a racist establishment that was common in any city at the time. None of that is ideal. People taking to the streets, of course that's going to happen. But Segru doesn't show that Detroit, as it was in, say, 1988, or in many of its neighborhoods now, had resulted because of those things. I think that at that same time that those riots were happening, the last thing that those struggling people needed was policies that were going to encourage the breakup of what were already fragile families. And I see it tipping
John, come on, man.
right at that time.
I think what those people need, I disagree with you. The fragile family thing would be way down my list. I think what they needed was a domestic Marshall Plan. I think what they needed was huge investments in their human development. I think they needed twice as much money per pupil to be spent at the schools that they were sending their teachers to. I think they needed decent housing that was going to be subsidized by the government rather than these high-rise public housing ghettos that were constructed to warehouse poor people. I think they needed way more aggressive intervention in the labor market to ensure that they got equal opportunities. That only came about fitfully and by degrees over the 20 years that followed. And it took a lot more legislation and Supreme Court decisions before you had effective equal opportunity in the labor market. In other words, I think they needed the kind of expansive social vision that other societies confronted with similar problems. I'm talking about France. I'm talking about Germany. I'm talking about Sweden. I'm talking even about England, were willing to embrace through their politics. And they didn't get any of that. Now, that welfare may have contributed to undermining their position by fostering bad habits and bad values. It's at least possible. Sure, you might be able to persuade me of that. But that was what they needed, not to have that done to them, when all these other things were not done that ought to have been done, that they were deserving of having done. It just seems to distort a pinched view of history, John.
History is so frustrating because it's never clean. Because what I want to ask you is, what historical situation can you think of where exactly what you said was done? I hear you. I get it. But where exactly what you said was done, and a generation later, things were more or less the way we wanted them to be. Now, the Marshall Plan is one thing, but one thing you notice about Europe, especially Europe in that era, or even in some countries, Europe today, is that that sort of thing is easier when there aren't the very tricky issues of ethnic heterogeneity and ethnic tension, and also in this country there was the burgeoning black power identity movement, and you can't quantify the effect of it on things. But if you had given all those things to the population we're talking about, you can't say definitely that things would be different, given the fact that there have been so many experiments on a smaller scale in this country where you do things such as giving lots of money to the schools and creating well-endowed schools in terms of equipment, etc. And it seems not to have an effect because we have a different social context than, say, Finland in 1955. And so it's so hard to know whether that Marshall Plan would have actually done the job. You could argue that even welfare adjustment was a Marshall Plan, in taking all those women away from being maids for the rest of their lives and giving them what at the time was thought to be the beginnings of what they could parlay into a middle-class existence. That ended up not working. I'm not sure any of us could say what could have been done to make it work. Don't you find these things a little more complicated than that?
Well, I want to respond. I don't want to accept your social history that what that was taking a lot of women away from maids and you know, whatever. But let me just acknowledge that for the sake of argument and move on to say I think there is an example of what I'm talking about, and I think it's the way that the United States of America and the several states reacted to the terrible trauma of the Great Depression and of the huge lower class, mostly from Eastern and Southern European immigration in the early 20th century into American cities. And I think what we did was we had the New Deal. And I think what we did was that we had the GI Bill. And I think that the consequences of that, massive mobilization of resources internally, this is the kind of thing that Katznelson is talking about, was to allow what might have been a white ethnic immigrant underclass to get more integrated into the structure of opportunity in American society. I mean, the murder rate in the United States was extraordinarily high at the end of Prohibition in the 1930s. It was nearly comparable to what you've seen in recent times in terms of the murder rate. And the degree of alcoholism, the degree of domestic violence, the extent of various other kind of indicia of social dysfunction amongst, Irish or Italian or even Jewish immigrant communities early in the 20th century was a great deal higher than a lot of people might know. And that when the country was in depression and when this pathology was, about to kind of take over massive parts of the society because of the lack of work and because of the fact that resources weren't there, we stepped in with the government and we mounted massive programs to deal with that. And I think it did make a difference for that strata of America's social hierarchy in helping those people move into the middle class.
You know something, though, Glenn? If you think about, take the Irish, because if you read about the Irish in many Irish communities 100 years ago, take away the names and the slang, and it can sound almost uncannily like a black inner city today.
Pat Moynihan used to say that all the time.
Yeah, and I think that I'm not aware of an argument that it was the New Deal that changed that. Rather, if you look at the history of Irish communities, and I almost hate to say this because it then brings us into this whole bootstraps argument, and I don't think that it's as simple as that. The Irish community leaders, many of whom we would now see as puritanical Carrie Nation types, kind of took the community, which felt itself to be a community in a way that the black community, as you've eloquently written today, does not, but took the community and raged against certain behaviors. There was a sense that we must show that we are respectable citizens. Now that is something that sounds very 1910, 1920 today, and I know that we couldn't take something as simple as that now. Our whole sense of respectability and WASP values and historical responsibility is different. But I don't think that it was putting men to work during the New Deal and using the WPA is what, quote-unquote, turned the Irish white. It was something that was a little slower and that did not lead to any kind of cathartic payoff in terms of the nation showing its responsibility for these poor immigrants that it had abused. Does that not have any relevance to what might go on for us?
I substantially agree with what you just said. I mean, I don't want to be overly simplistic in saying, that the assimilation or incorporation of various ethnic marginal groups was, entirely driven by the advent of the New Deal
Roosevelt,
and the resources
right.
of the GI Bill. That would be overly simple. But I think those things, as Cass Nelson argues in his book, were very helpful. But I agree with you that that's a longer process and that there is a cultural component to it. And I agree with you about the importance of a kind of self-awareness and a reflexive kind of quest for respectability and a respect for the opinion of the rest of the society and desire to fit in and to make oneself, as Booker T. Washington used to argue all the time, make oneself fit for equality. If you don't get any respect, be respectable. How can you expect people to respect you if you're not respectable? I agree that all of those things are important, and the way they play out, if I just finish this, the way they play out with African Americans in the latter part of the 20th century has been different and less good for African Americans than the way those same dynamics may have played out during the settlement house movement, or whatever it was that was trying to incorporate the unruly Irish or whatever, into the American mainstream.
Glenn, may I ask you a question?
Yeah, sure.
But if we do this again, in between this time and the next time, I am going to read the paper you mentioned by Glazer and Cutler. That's
okay, and you got something for me to read?
Yeah, and it's not as deep as them, but I want to know what you would think of Come On People by Bill Cosby and Alvin Toussaint.
Okay.
They don't have any fancy numbers or statistics, but talk about Booker T. Washington, they are not as punitive as that. But they've written what I think is the best book for the ordinary reader that I have ever seen, which gives a realistic way for people who've been left behind to make the best of a bad situation in this society that will sit so intransigently, as we all know, pretty much the way it is. I'd like to know what you think of that book, which it's not a punitive book.
Yeah.
It's just there. But it's worth reading despite the fact that it's not written by academics. So I'd be interested to know what you thought.
Oh, well, great. Let's talk. I mean, I have the book, and I've glanced at it, and I see what they're doing. I got it after I saw Cosby and Toussaint on Meet the Press one Sunday morning, maybe 2 months ago, with Tim Russert. And I was so infuriated, and I can tell you why by that appearance. This is no slam at the book. The book may be everything that you said. I haven't read it yet. I will, and we'll discuss. But I was
you didn't like that.
Pardon?
You didn't like that appearance.
Well, I was infuriated by it. Not only did I not like it, I thought it was a travesty. And let me...
You get so angry.
What, isn't it interesting how people can have such different reactions to things?
Yeah.
Because, let me just say this, okay? I like Bill Cosby, and I respect and admire what he's been trying to do, because he doesn't have to do this.
Right.
You know what I'm saying?
That's right.
He's already got all the money he could ever spend, and if you could argue that this is not going to do anything but bring him a lot of grief from a lot of quarters, which he'd probably rather not have that grief
when everybody has loved him for years, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So he makes himself a conscience. He doesn't have to do this. So it's obviously heartfelt and sincere. There can't be any doubt about that in my mind, anyway. That Bill Cosby is sincere in what he's trying to do. But the thing that infuriated me about Meet the Press, and I can put it in a bumper sticker. The book is called Come On People. That is Cosby and Toussaint. And I want to say precisely, come on, American people. Right? So they're saying, come on, people, and they're saying, come on, black people. Okay? So they come on Meet the Press, which is Tim Russert, Sunday morning. This is like the town square. This is where America... communicates and does its political business. I mean, the last time I looked at Tim Russert, he was interviewing, I don't know who, the Prime Minister of Pakistan or presidential candidate or the Secretary of Defense or whatever, And every time I watch Tim Russert, he always has well-prepared gotcha questions. He always comes up with the videotape of what they said 10 years ago and how can they square what they're doing now with what they said. In other words, but now for 1 hour... he sits there and watches Cosby's powerful facial expressions. I mean, television is a really, as you know, I mean, you're a culture guy, deeply subliminal medium, right? I mean, it's working on us at all different levels. And there's Cosby grimacing those grimaces, smiling those smiles, I mean, worrying that worry, all etched in that famous visage of his. And he's recounting, come on, black people, why don't you pull up your socks? Why don't you act better? Why don't you do this? Why don't you do that? And I'm thinking, there's no criticism here. Russert is just kind of taking all of this in. And I'm thinking, we're talking to the American public here, and we have this precious opportunity to appeal to them on a moral basis about this or that. And what do we do with it? We use it to give a homily about how black people could be better instead of drawing the nation's attention to the ways in which we, the people of the United States, could be better. So I was really very disappointed with that.
I understand what you mean, but the way I see it is there has to be a come on, people. And you're right. He did not pull the business of showing the film clip that kind of throws you or something like that. That is true. It was uncritical. And I think that there's something in Russert that really does lean towards views of those kinds. Now that I think of it, when I was on Meet the Press, I got a softball treatment too. Yeah. But the fact of the matter is...
I may just say, John, I want to hear what you have to say. That's condescending to not give people really sharp criticism and to just kind of,
Well, on the other hand, I had to do it with Marion Wright Edelman, who's sitting right there, and that was one of the most challenging opponents I've ever had. So it's not like I was sitting there alone. I wish I had
seen that. I think I may look that one up.
I hear it was pretty good. I don't watch myself. But he did not ask me any challenging questions. And it's not
that takes real discipline. You don't watch yourself?
No, I don't find myself very fascinating, to be honest.
Wait. I watch myself, and it's not like I find myself all that fascinating. It's just that I'm curious to know how I did, so I watch myself.
No, because the time that it takes, like if I watch this, I'd be sitting at my computer for an hour, and to be perfectly honest, I either want to read a book, or play the piano, or play with my cat. I mean, life is so short. There are only 24 hours in a day, so I rarely see myself unless I hear so much about it that I want to check out what's going on.
Let me ask you this. Do you read the blog that is developed after these blogging heads are posted? The comments that people put up and such?
Well, I kept hearing so much about our last one that I think I read the first 8 or 9, but then I started thinking I could be reading something else. And so I just kind of moved on. I just don't find what I said interesting because I know what I said. And
your logic is impeccable. You're absolutely right. I'm afraid I don't know what it is, vanity or something. I can't help it. I have to look and see how it came off.
Do you really look at yourself?
Well, I look at myself, and I also read these blogs because I want to know what people are saying. If I were on Meet the Press, you're darn right I would look at that in order to see how I did. In other words, I would study it because I would want to be better next time, and I would also want to form my own judgment about whether or not Marion Wright Edelman kicked the mess out of me or whether or not I wiped the floor with her or whatever the right metaphor is,
I heard so much that suggested that I did fine, and I have a picture of it. And I can imagine that picture moving. And so, although I will admit that the blogs, now and again these days, I am checking them out. Because, for the reason that you said, the bloggers can be so recreationally mean. And I really don't like that aspect of our culture because I try not to do that. But
they can
the fact is that some of them sometimes do show me where I could have been clearer or something like that.
Wait a minute. I got to ask you this now because I read Winning the Race. Okay? Mm-hmm. And if I'm not mistaken, you go out of your way at the beginning of that book to review what some people have said to you. Maybe it's emails, not blogs or whatever. But I mean, you're still kind of going over the record. Well, I wrote this book, well, then people said this and that, and you spend, to my mind, too many pages. I'm sorry,
really?
telling me what people said to you about, what they thought about you, using anecdotes from your correspondence and so forth. So maybe there's a little solipsism in there somewhere, John.
Well, the emails come to you, and I used to read them more than I do now. And I did find it more interesting in the beginning. Once suddenly you're hearing from all these strangers. Now, frankly, it's almost never that somebody says something that I haven't heard before. I'm sure you know how that is. It's just there are only so many things to say. And email was one thing, but with blogs, you have to go search it out yourself. And once again, I want to go cook a meal, I want to go read my book or something like that. So I'm not as engaged in that. And blogs were not as big when I wrote Winning the Race as they are now.
It reminds me of...
go ahead.
I was just going to say, I'm amused by this, and it reminds me of the fictional Sherlock Holmes, who, in my boyhood, I read all those Sherlock Holmes things, and there's one of them where he explains to Watson why it is that he doesn't know some very obvious things, right? I can't remember the example, but it's something that everybody should know, like, Valentine's Day at February 14th or something like that. Mm-hmm. But he doesn't know that because he says, well, there's only so many hours in a day and there's so many facts that the brain can hold. I'm interested in solving crime, so I only know the things that I need to know.
I sympathize with that.
Right. So he knows all these obscure facts, that is, about what kind of leaf of what kind of plant gives off a resin, which when mixed with a certain, thing will create a poisonous gas that will have this effect on the body, which can be detected by whatever, But he doesn't know that February 14th is Valentine's Day.
And that's me because, like, for example, I'm doing the second performance of my cabaret show here in New York, obscure old theater and movie songs that nobody knows except me and 500 obsessives. I'm keeping all the lyrics in my head. I have to know who wrote them, and I have to do patter in between the songs. And people pay money to come see me do it. I have to keep that in my head. I am certainly not going to watch myself on Meet the Press or read my old articles. That's exactly it. But the thing about Meet the Press is that with Cosby and Poussin, can't you think that isn't that really something that is such a valuable message that Cosby could be given a pass on being kicked in the shins a little bit? I thought that it was just what was needed because expression, live expression, especially from Black America's beloved grandfather, is something that can motivate people, along with, say, religion, in a way that a 250-page book cannot, and then that can get around on YouTube. I thought that it was something that could do some good. And
we'll
you're
see.
thinking
I don't
about
know.
white America.
John, I just know you asked me about examples. I know of no example in human history where behavioral change on the scale that we're talking about that would be needed. I mean, we got all these kids in prison.
Right.
Okay? All these high school dropouts, all of these single parents, this huge achievement gap in the schools.
Yeah.
I'm just not aware of any case in human history where behavioral change at the level of the subjects, of the people who are caught in these backwaters, on the scale that would be necessary here, has been brought about by exhortation, by speeches, by sermons. When have a people been talked out of poverty?
Never.
Pull up your socks, be better. When has better ever been a solution to poverty?
No, people standing up and making statements, and I've read you saying that, and you're absolutely right, that can't work. And now we're back to that issue that we got to in our last one of these, which is that too often, because that is certainly true, many people think that, well, the government has to have a role, which it certainly does, and I write about it all the time, but that cannot be what we think about 73% of the time and just kind of pay lip service to the sorts of things that Cosby and Poussin are saying. Maybe I'm being too exact here, maybe I'm being idealistic, but it really has to be 50-50. We have to be as aroused by the sorts of things that Cosby and Poussin are saying as we are by what just happened to Michael Vick or by somebody hanging a noose from some door. It has to be absolutely 50-50.
I have no brief for Michael Vick, but I hear you. And I don't know how to put a number on it, but I'm not unsympathetic to what you just said, that you have to have things in proportion. Right. You have to have things in proportion. But here's the distinction I would make. I wonder if you find value in it. I mean, I would distinguish between the communal and the civic. Okay, so the communal is about, like, what kind of people are we black people? If it's going to be a black community, I mean, you could argue maybe it shouldn't even be defined in terms of race or ethnicity. Maybe it should be defined in some other ways, But maybe Cosby's appeal should be going out in some other ways. Although we have the cultural baggage that we've inherited, we can't reinvent every metaphor and every artifice that we use to move and communicate with each other. So to the extent that these identity dynamics around race are important to people, a guy like Bill Cosby might have an effect. So there's that communal conversation, the preacher who preaches out to the congregation, obey the Protestant virtues and you will prosper. Who tries to tell the little girls to not get pregnant and tries to tell the little boys to stay away from the drug dealer and the temptation of the gang and all of this. My friend Ron Ferguson at Harvard, the Achievement Gap Initiative that he is running there, which is largely about trying to discover behavioral mechanisms that parents and students use that are associated with good performance and to make sure that black people know about them. I have no problem with that whatsoever. I think is important. Okay, so that's the communal agenda. But the civic agenda is about the law, it's about the policies, and it's about the state. And the two things are not, you can't substitute one for the other. They kind of sit side by side. Now, whether it's 50-50, 30-70, I don't know. But there needs to be both. And what I saw on Meet the Press was an opportunity to advance the civic agenda, since that's a public forum. He's not mainly talking to black people. He's mainly talking to Americans. And to talk to Americans about the communal problems of black people just invites a kind of distancing, a kind of objectifying people sitting back and saying, "Oh, that's the way they are." Well, Cosby's right. They really do need to get better.
Of course,
it doesn't have anything to do with me. They're saying when in fact it has everything to do with them.
Glenn, this is where I don't get you. This is exactly the locus. Yes, white people are going to look at it and say that. And let's face it, what other way could there be? You walk down the street and you look at a corporate white whatever who's eating lunch with his friends. You see a cashier who's white and she's working there or he's working there. And yeah, Glenn, they don't care. They don't feel responsible, and I don't think that's going to change. More to the point, the civic responsibility is that of lawmakers. And so I think it's the issue of showing specifically what sorts of policies, and this is how we're talking about MSAN, Ron Ferguson's work.
Yeah.
That is the way. Your sense that somehow the cashier and the corporate lawyer and whoever is watching Meet the Press while eating their breakfast are somehow ever going to feel responsible. I don't think they're going to. I don't think they need to, and so it doesn't bother me.
Let me respond to that, because I want to say a couple of things. On Meet the Press, I would have appreciated it, not that the thing had been giving over entirely to talking about policies and how bad America is and why don't we spend more on our poor and so forth, but that there had been a counterpoint to Cosby's homily, so that what the viewers in America's Civic Forum who were looking at that particular performance got was a balanced presentation of the issue. To the extent that Cosby wanted to talk about, come on, black people, be better, I wish that the moderator had challenged him by saying, yeah, but don't we have other issues here, and don't we have to ask about the responsibilities of people who are outside the black community, responsibilities they have even for things that are going on inside the black community. So I would have just appreciated more balance. On the other point, though, about whether or not you can persuade people, whether or not it should be a campaign to tear the clerk on the corner, the woman who's working and fixing somebody's hair, or who's behind the who's serving me when I come in to get my dental work done, and whether I can, by writing impassioned social criticism about America's failures, move that person to see things differently. I don't give up on that at all. I don't see that to you. You say it'll never happen. And here's what I think. What I think is that, and it's not just about race and inequality, about what kind of society locks up 2.25 million people, about why our cities have some of the worst districts anywhere in the world, and we're supposed to be the richest country in the world, or about why racial hierarchy remains a seemingly permanent part of the American landscape, notwithstanding now 40 years after the Civil Rights. It's not just those issues. It's all the issues. It's, for example, war and peace. It's, for example, whether or not Islamofascism is the way that you want to talk about the issue, or whether or not whether or not liberators versus occupiers is the way you want to think about putting an army on the ground in the Middle East, or whatever.
Sure.
In other words, I just want to say this. The moral argument, trying to appeal to the better nature of people, even ordinary people who are working ordinary jobs, across all of those issues, has to be a part, doesn't it, of the way in which you get social reform?
Of course. Of course, but the thing is, couldn't you say that the general kind of bien-pensant conversation in much of the American media and among many of America's intelligent people is the counterpoint to what happened on Meet the Press that morning? It's not as if that Meet the Press is the whole universe. And I challenge you on this particular point. Now, you saw Cosby and Poussin have their say unopposed for an hour, and it bothered you because you wanted to see the other side given. Now, I don't know what your answer to this is going to be, but if they had Bell Hooks or Manning Marable or somebody on there, and they were giving their view for the entire hour, wouldn't you feel that it would be okay for them to go unopposed because maybe society gives the Bill Cosby view in its way? Like, how would you feel if Manning Marable got to go on for an hour about entrenched inequality and just leave it at that? It seems to me that wouldn't have bothered you as much, and I'm not sure why.
I'm not sure. You could be right. I don't want to just. It would be easy for me to say no, because I'm not necessarily a big fan of Manning Marable, and I'm not.
I'm picking him at
random.
random.
If he had gone on, and if Manning Marable, God bless him, had gone on for an hour, I fear that after the first 15 minutes, he may have been doing the cause more harm than work. But I see your point. Your point is that it's not just that particular occasion when arguments are made, and there's plenty of background argument in the culture for the position that I like, and so forth and so on. And, okay, I'll grant you that.
It's just a point. Yeah.
I'll grant you that. So, I mean, we survived the Tim Russert interview with Bill Cosby. I mean, we progressives survived. It's not like we're unheard from when we talk about domestic Marshall plans and the inadequacy of social policy in America. So,
and look at the Supreme Court's decision just this morning about sentencing disparities. So things happen slowly, but they happen.
Okay, so what do we want to do? We're going to stop now?
Well, I'm trying, because of the nature of the medium, not to look at my watch, but I'm going to do it now. How long have we been going?
We've been going 1 hour and 10 minutes. I want to talk with you about the Israeli-Palestinian situation.
We should do it the next time.
Pardon?
Because we should do it the next time.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to rush that. That would.
We don't want to rush that one.
No, I mean, there's a lot. I would think there'd be a lot to say there, don't you?
That's a tough issue. Yeah. And I've been reading up about the history of it, too, just for my own elucidation, instead of watching myself on television. And so,
I have a very good book that I could recommend to you. I mean, a book that I really admire a lot by two Israelis. It's called Lords of the Land by Edith Zertal, Zertal, and Akiva Eldar. And it's a history of the occupation of the territories that were seized in the 1967 war, of the settlement movement.
That came out a month ago, didn't it?
Pardon? Yeah, it came out recently.
That's kind of new, isn't it?
Came out recently. It's been well reviewed.
Yeah, I read about that.
And I mean, it's you can't read it in an afternoon, but it's a very impressive work of scholarship and a very impassioned work of social criticism.
I will look at it.
There are other sides to the issue, I think one has to say, and we will undoubtedly be reminded of that. But yeah, if you look at that, we can talk about that. We can talk about Come On People.
That's right. And I'll look at I'll look at the Cutler and Glazer article. Yeah.
Okay.
All sorts of stuff.
Okay. Well, I enjoyed talking with you, John, as always.
You too, Glenn. This was fantastic.
Okay. Take care. We'll see you soon.
You too.
Oh, John, I have one question.
Sure.
Are you still there? I'm going to be in New York on Thursday. You say you're performing around town and stuff? I mean, it'd be great to get together for a drink or something. Do you think you might have any time?
Let's have the drink. My last show is tomorrow on Tuesday, so you're going to have to miss that.
Congratulations. Break a leg and all that stuff, and I'll give you a call.
I'm around on Thursday, so yeah, call me up.
Okay, bye.
Goodbye.